I was working on some of the strategies for our clients, and I started thinking like, oh shit, the way I think about content strategy has changed so much over like since the beginning of my career. Because at the beginning of my career, I was just like, oh yeah, just do some keyword research and then write some articles about them. And I think this is very timely too, because Ali, you've been rethinking about our whole strategy process. And so I was like, I think we should all, because we all started in content. So I figured, hey, let's all chat about how our thinking has evolved. Because I think maybe the industry has been and maybe should continue evolving as well from just how we used to do it, and even now how we're currently doing it is probably we might see where it's gonna go. But maybe a good starting point here is like, how did we originally think about content strategy? If we were to think about if like a couple years ago or earlier on in our careers, what did you all think content strategy was, or how did you do it back then?
Do you remember the first time you like learned about content marketing? Because for me, it was this audiobook that I read. Well, maybe I knew about content marketing before, but I didn't really call it content marketing because I had read authors like Ryan Holiday and Tim Ferriss and their blogs. And I guess that was content marketing. But the first time I heard it kind of wrapped in terminology was reading Joe Polizzi's book. It wasn't Content Inc. It was the one before that, but he was the founder of Content Marketing Institute. And the book was eye-opening, but it really just like listed a bunch of different content formats and ideas. It's like, oh, you could create like an industry newspaper. You could create a magazine. You could do a blog post. You could do infographics. And I was like, wow, all of these creative ways to like market your company just through kind of like organic written word, essentially. And I think that was largely the idea that I had in my mind of content when I first got into it. It was just like brainstorm a bunch of topics that you care about and maybe your audience cares about, write them, make them to the best of your ability. And that's kind of it. Like that was basically it. And I think that actually follows the trajectory of most kind of like disciplines and their maturity curve. Because if I think back to like experimentation and CRO, most of the books at the start, when people just started learning about that term, conversion rate optimization, they were like, hey, you can run A/B tests. Like you can test button colors, you can test landing pages, you can test copy. And it was just this like evangelist kind of way to say like, hey, here's a thing you can do. And then over time that starts to get honed in. And it's like, maybe you shouldn't test everything. Maybe you shouldn't create infographics. Maybe that's not right for your business. And that's when, you start to hone in on kind of a more mature version of strategy. That was my introduction anyway.
Yeah, when I was freelancing, I was very siloed. Like I was just one part of the process. This was like 2016. So my first few clients were publications. So I was never really introduced to conversion like strategy within content because that's not what they were trying to do. It was mostly just to drive traffic and eyeballs. So I think my first true introduction to content strategy was at HubSpot, but it like was very rooted in SEO. So I think from the start, connected SEO, content, and strategy very closely because those were the strongest two factors in my role as a staff writer and a content marketer. And as I progressed there, there was a low ceiling. We've had conversations about this and everything, but I think that's why when we started creating our strategies at Omniscient, that was kind of my starting point. So when we would do our content roadmap reports and build kind of our actions to take on behalf of our clients, the starting point was like topical and like rooted in SEO. We didn't really back up anymore and talk about like audience or goals or any of that stuff. I think we did at the high level, but in terms of how we presented our strategy, for me, it was very reminiscent of what I had used at HubSpot and then what I had taken with me into my later roles. So that was my introduction to strategy, was definitely through the lens of SEO. So limited for sure.
Yeah. I think I didn't learn content strategy. I learned content marketing. And it was when I was just trying to understand what my marketing career was. And I was reading like Quick Sprout articles and they had like a content marketing 101 guide or something. And yeah, it was the same thing as what you read, Alex, where it was just, here are all the different type of content types you can create. Yeah. These are infographics and these are social media things. And I remember going into one of my first like part-time jobs being like, you should do social media, you should do ebooks, you should do blog posts and all this shit. And then over time, I realized, oh, it's more of like figuring out what you want to write about. And then you can figure out what mediums it should be. But I think lately what we've been talking about is it's actually saying no to a lot of all those things you could do and figure out, like, I think strategy is just this nebulous term. So, and I think Alex, you have a good definition of it, but now we're starting to pull it all the way back before we even talk about topics or formats or anything like that. We're like, wait, what the hell are we going to do? Like, what is the strategy? And we're starting to peel back that onion, I guess, with clients now, where we're like, okay, we're not talking topics or keywords here. We didn't know what your business strategy is before we started even talking about content.
Yeah. I think that's where, like, my early education, I was not taught about how to tie content to business goals. Now I had a very specific role at HubSpot, right? Like, there was a large company, so there was probably no reason for that to be taught to me early on, but it's something that I had to kind of teach myself, because, like, what is the point of all of this if we're not going to help grow a business and grow revenue or help our clients meet their goals, whatever they are? And I think starting there, like I said, starting from the true starting line, understanding, like, who are we talking to and what do we want to tell them? How are we going to get their attention? What are we going to do with that attention? And then how do we know it's working? Like, all of those things need to be answered first before you even get to the topics. But yeah, we've talked about how nebulous strategy can be and how, like, there's so many different definitions and everything, especially when it pertains to content.
I would say there's even a window a little farther back, which is like, how does this play into the marketing strategy and the general business goals and trajectory and the pace that you want to grow those? Because I was maybe on the tactical level, but if I look back at my experience at Lawn Starter, we actually had a strategy that kind of mapped up towards the company and growth goals. And what we were doing with content was actually, it was a fairly sophisticated approach, in that we knew that people weren't going to necessarily read articles about lawn care or landscaping and sign up for basically an Uber for lawn care app. But we knew that there was bottom funnel search keywords for these terms, and they were mainly playing in the realm of, like, local SEO. So this is like, people would search Austin lawn care or Washington, DC landscaping. But it takes a lot of links and a lot of, like, kind of SEO juice to build up, the authority to rank for those pages. So what we would do was create sort of link bait content, infographics, and things that would surely never convert. And we would just drive tons of links. We would do, like, scholarships, and we would do ego bait for different, like, local newspapers and stuff like that. And all of those would funnel back into those landing pages. And that was kind of like the growth goal. It's like, how can we, increase the organic rankings and traffic through those? Because that's how we're going to get users. And that was the end goal of the company, right? So in that way, like, we kind of map back even more so. And we don't just say, like, how do we want to write this piece? How are we going to reach them? But, like, how is content even fitting into this puzzle of marketing in the first place?
Yeah. Like, if we use that Lawn Starter example, it sounds like the strategy was, we know people search for local lawn care services. We see that there's an opportunity to rank for these. However, in order to rank for them, we need things like backlinks and traffic to those pages. Great. We can't just write this content and expect it to rank. We need to go do these other tactical things in order to get them to rank. But the goal is to rank, like, get people looking for those services right now to actually find Lawn Starter.
Right. The acquisition goals are going to be user growth. And then underneath that, the goals for content are going to be to rank those organic pages, because we could map out the total addressable market of those, or, like, the overall search volume, and realize that was a good investment if you compared it to other channels like paid search or sort of integrations or anything else we could have done. And that was a worthwhile goal. So then we're like, all right, well, how are we going to rank for those? Then it's like, all right, the strategy is to create link bait pages, link bait blog posts and infographics that then kind of, like, increase our domain rating and, like, pass the link juice onto those pages. And then underneath that's the tactics. That's where it's like, all right, we're going to run a scholarship. We're going to create an infographic on why everybody's moving to Austin. And we're going to, like, send that out to all the local publications and newspapers, et cetera. And those were sort of the ground level things that we would do on a day-to-day basis. But the overall content strategy was sort of fulfilling those organic landing pages to facilitate user growth. And that was totally different, by the way, than, like, my next experience at CXL, which was totally an expertise-led company. And teaching people how to do things like A/B testing or analytics, like within our articles, our long form pieces, was actually a totally valid way to get them to sign up for either the institute for courses or for the agency, right? Because you're sort of showcasing your expertise in those areas. So it was like a totally different approach.
Yeah, and what I found just talking to prospects and even our current clients is, it almost always boils down to either we want to drive revenue, we want to get market share. I think it's just those two. And then like market share is where it's like, we want to get essentially more people thinking about us earlier on in the process, where they're not necessarily focused on direct revenue, but they're like, we need to at least let people know we exist. And then the people who want revenue are like, we want leads from this content. And I find that on sales calls, people always say we want to do organic and SEO. And I just keep asking them why it's important. And it always comes back to, well, we don't really want just traffic, we want leads. And then that helps like define the rest of the conversation, where it's like, okay, well, let's talk about who your ICPs are, who's your buying persona, who's involved, what's your brand point of view. And then we start talking about things far beyond just what keywords do you want to rank for.
Yeah, I think the point, like they want to get leads through organic content. That's a fine goal, but then you have to start thinking about like what's the individualized strategy to accomplish that goal. And I think that's where a lot of the conversation breaks down in this industry, because people either say like, all right, I want to do what my competitor's doing, which is like the worst possible thing, right? Like we've had to turn down clients before. This is essentially like they should do a SWOT analysis and actually like look at their weaknesses and be honest about them, because we've had companies that are like, hey, we're a new startup. We just raised our seed round or our Series A, and we're competing against Intercom and Drift and HubSpot. And we want to do organic, but we can only publish like 4 times a month. And it's like, well, how, in what world do you think you can win at that strategy, given that HubSpot and Drift and all these companies did this years, if not decades ago? Like that's a huge one. But that's essentially like the goal of like leads through content, leads through SEO. That can be further broken down into like dozens of different strategies. And the other problem, by the way, outside of the competitor thing, is often people will get very, very focused on their unique strategy, like their one kind of playbook, right? You see this with like, all right, only go after bottom funnel keywords, or only high tempo content, like only publish a ton, or, you know, like people have this like the Maslow's hammer, you know, everything looks like a nail if all you have is a hammer, and people get very fixated on their like one approach. But I think it's much more fluid. In the world that I want to live in for content anyway, it's very individualized.
Yeah. So how do we define like what's a strategy then? Because I think we've kind of hammered away at the point that, hey, a list of tactics isn't a strategy. Even saying like a goal of generating leads is not a strategy. That's the outcome of what you want to do. How would y'all define, or like what are some examples of what a good strategy is?
Can I give like a high level metaphor for a strategy first? So I think of it like, and this may be like, an approximation, but I think of it like if you were going to take a trip to, well, let's say like, where do we want to travel to, right? Like that's your goal. Maybe you want to go to San Francisco for a conference or something like that. And where you start from matters a lot. Like if you're starting from Oakland, like your strategy is going to be completely different than if you're starting from New York City. And then, so that's the strategy, is like how you get there, right? And that depends on your weaknesses, your strengths, your assets, what you have available. If you have a car, like that's an option for you. But if you don't have a car, could you rent a car? Oh, you don't have the money for that, right? Like, are you going to hitchhike? Like, can you take a plane? Do you need to get there faster because, like you've got a conference at a certain time that you need to be there? All of those things kind of inform like the route that you take there. And then the individual tactics are like, all right, we're taking a road trip. We're going to stop this many times on the way, and we're going to take the scenic route because I actually want to see Sedona. So it kind of like maps back down to that. But if you don't know where you're going, and if you don't know where you're starting and the assets that you have available for you, then it's almost impossible to say like which route is the best way to get there.
And the modes of transportation would be the tactics.
The modes of transportation is more of a strategy. Well, it's more of a strategy. It's like if you're going to take a road trip versus a plane versus a train or something like that, because that has to do with like how much money do you have, how many suitcases are you bringing, like what size of a party are you traveling with, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And then the individual decisions along that journey, I think, are largely the tactics.
I see.
It's how you complete that journey. How do you complete that road trip?
Yeah.
How much gas do you need to get there? I
think it's also answering why, like why you want to take a plane versus why you want to take a road trip. Like there's no right or wrong answer. It's just, especially if you're like in marketing leadership or communicating to marketing leadership, why you believe your strategy is the best case. The question is going to be, well, why do you think we should do it this way versus those other ways? So you need to be able to say like, well, we're on a budget, so we can't necessarily fly all these people, but we can have 5 people in the car and it'll like be more cost efficient. We don't have a ton of urgency, so we can do that. And it'll be more fun for the team. Like just being able to explain the why and reason things out is like a huge part of strategy that I think people tend to miss. Because like you'll ask people what their goals are or why they believe this is the best way to do things, and they'll be like, well, isn't it the only way to do it? Or isn't it like, why isn't it obvious that it's the clearest reason? And it's like, well, not everyone thinks very differently. And so like a big part of strategy is communicating the why with the additional context.
And the important part of doing that too, it's an exercise that will actually force you to say, we don't have the resources to do this. Like we have a Tesla and the only way we can get to San Francisco is on a road trip. Like this is not feasible, or it's not going to be fun, right? Or you're like, the only route here is a train and we don't want to take the train. We're not willing to invest in that long of a time frame. So like, we're just not going to do that. And we're just going to like scrap that trip and think about something else. And that's totally fine too. But a lot of people think, all right, I have to go here. I have to do content. I have to do this specific playbook, but they don't think about like the inherent weaknesses or limitations or forcing functions that they're going to have to go through to actually meet that goal, essentially. And then you bring in like all of these like market trends and competitors and all of that stuff too. And things just get so much more complicated. So that's the bulk of why strategy is so hard and so important too. And why I think we've turned down so many people who say like, hey, yeah, we got a list of like 20 keywords. Our SEO agency gave it to us years ago. And if you could just write these, that would be great. Like, we want to be part of a winning team, right? And that's not like a winning approach.
Yeah. And maybe like to get even like very concrete, I just want to go with that example of a prospect that was like, yeah, we're a live chat. We want to compete with HubSpot, Drift, Intercom, Zendesk, like whatever else company has a live chat feature. And they're saying, yeah, we want to win on organic. And you have to take a look at the why. And it's like, well, why do you believe that? If I were them, I don't think there's any reason to believe they could win on organic, like against any of those. And so you need to go back like, okay, what's the goal? And then if they say, well, our goal is to get like some customers, then you can start thinking about, well, what are the different paths to getting customers for you? Like if it's content as a medium or a channel, then let's think about that, but also be open to other mediums. If they were talking to us, they're probably sold on content and they know it works. They just don't know how exactly to do it. And so then we can start talking about, okay, well, where are you different when it comes to content? What's different about your product or company compared to all the incumbents? What's your messaging and positioning? Yeah. That's going to define like all that business strategy is what defines content strategy. Because then now we can say, oh, you have a very different opinion on how live chat should be done compared to these incumbents who've been doing it for 10 years. Great. Let's talk about that. But that's not an organic traffic play. That's like positioning and naming your enemy and like thought leadership play, which is not going to get them organic traffic. So like, that's just a concrete example of questioning some of your assumptions and asking why. And then like when you can't answer a why with a good response, you step back and you're like, wait, what are the other options here like that we should be considering?